From San Antonio, Texas, with Mariah Medina, Jordan Elder, and John Hunter, criminal defense attorney. We had something that just happened today in the Brad Simpson, Suzanne Simpson case. You may not be hearing a whole lot from people that are involved with this case after the judge put a gag order on people that are involved in the case. And this is why we have you here today, John. Explain to us exactly what does that gag order that you just read means? Who can talk?
Sure. Well, it isn't a global gag order. The media still can talk about it. People not involved with the case can still talk about it, but it is prohibiting the parties, the litigants, witnesses in the case, people who have already given evidence and statements from communicating with the press. And that's been done in an effort and attempt to protect Mr. Simpson's right to a fair trial and to try and prevent the media from potentially poisoning the jury pool in San Antonio.
I think you probably want to jump into this one. I mean, we've all been covering this case. What do you think about what he just said?
Well, something that we had talked about briefly is, will this actually have any positive or any impact for that matter on the case? And John seems to think that this could potentially have a positive impact in terms of ensuring that Brad Simpson has a fair trial. Something that somebody had commented on Twitter in response to a tweet about the order, with the order, was, what are they so afraid of? And it's spelled out in the order. But John, you've covered or you've represented individuals in high profile cases. Does the media discourse around these cases actually impact the cases?
Absolutely. I mean, the media is going to have a head start in sort of priming the pump in the minds of the general public about what the case is about. What's the story about? What do we think happened? And that's based upon lots of different sources of information, some of whom are reliable, some of whom may not be reliable. Things change as an investigation gets underway. And so you do end up, by the time you go to trial on something that's got a lot of media coverage, like having to do battle with this sort of fictitious universe that's been created. I mean, in the Howerton case, there was a lot of talk about, the rough sex and the steroid use, and this narrative was like just cemented in people's heads, and that made it really challenging to dive into the facts a little bit more carefully and realize that, like, this isn't your stereotypical roid rage case. But I mean, your work's cut out for you, because by the time that Howerton was tried the first time, there had been 2 years of the media just relentlessly discussing that. So, I mean, that's the issue you face in those kinds of things.
My question would be, why now? There's been a lot of media coverage on this case from the very start. There has been social media buzz since Suzanne Simpson went missing. So you mentioned the information coming from reliable and non-reliable sources. Is this going to push the non-reliable sources a little bit more because some of the reliable sources can't get that info?
Well, it would just be, I think, too hard to expect the media is going to be able to get all of the reliable information in a digestible format. I mean, what the gag order's objective is to try and do is, number one, to prevent the discovery in the case from being used as a weapon for either side, right? I mean, the lawyers shouldn't be fronting the nuggets of evidence that they think are best for their case to a reporter so that gets lots of airtime. That creates an unfair advantage. So that's the objective there. You ask why now? It hasn't been indicted, but for like a week or something like that. And now the district judge has jurisdiction to enter an order like that. So that's probably why the timing of it is. I mean, the reality is, when a case is this high profile, before charges are brought, media is just going to pounce on it, and it's going to just be increasingly talked about, and it's sort of a free-for-all until the court actually gets a hold of it and starts to take charge.
And I find it really interesting that the gag order is coming on now for that simple matter. I mean, all you have to do is look at the interest that the community has in this case. What's going on with it? At this point, how easy is it going to be for them to find a jury that has never heard of Suzanne Simpson or Brad living here in San Antonio in Bexar County?
It's going to be very hard. I mean, it may be an impossibility. I don't know, but it's going to be a significant challenge. And then you have to ask yourself, okay, well, just because there is a lot of media coverage and it may be a well-known case, doesn't necessarily mean that you can't get a fair trial. And that analysis is fairly complicated. And unfortunately, a lot of times the analysis isn't really going to be something that the lawyers can work through until it's over. I mean, if he's found guilty and there's an appellate process, that's really when a lot of that gets, poured over with a fine-tooth comb. Until then, it's a judgment call by the court, and it's a judgment call by the litigants. And, ultimately, Mr. Simpson may want his case tried in San Antonio, even if there is a lot of saturation in the pool, because his lawyers are from here. He's from here. He knows this community. And there are reasons why you might say, look, I'm being maligned in the press. I'll be maligned in the press in any county in the state that I'm brought to, but at least I know the landscape. I know the people. My lawyers know the landscape and know the people. So maybe they decide not to worry about that.
Mariah, and you were in court yesterday. Actually, all three of us were in court yesterday. You were on the criminal side while we were over on the civil side. Talk to us about yesterday and when his brother walked out, and explain to people who may be seeing this across the country or somewhere outside of the U.S. what happened yesterday on the criminal side of this case.
So yesterday was the first time Brad Simpson was in court since he'd been indicted, since he'd been arrested in open court. And so he was brought in. It was a very brief process. The judge reset the case, meaning essentially rescheduled Brad to appear at a later date. That's December 19th at 9 a.m., which we will be there. But that is to hear a motion to potentially be able to talk to his kids. Since he was arrested, it's my understanding that he hasn't been able to talk to any of his children. But again, his appearance in court was extremely brief, and the judge walked him in, called the case. He went up there, and he was in and out. Even then, family and friends of Suzanne Simpson and Brad Simpson showed up, and some of her friends had donned pink and purple scarves in observance of domestic violence awareness, as well as in support of Suzanne Simpson. But his brother was the only individual that talked to members of the media afterwards, and he took a few questions. So as part of this order now, his brother, friends and family, a lot of people are on this list. In reading this, John had said that this is pretty narrowly tailored, but when you think about all of the court documents that mention all the interviews that law enforcement had gotten with individuals that have information relevant to this case, the list of people that can't talk to us anymore is pretty extensive. But I did want to raise a question that you had, Yami. How does this impact, the daughters that are pretty vocal on social media? Does this prevent, Bart Simpson or even Suzanne's children from posting to social media to just offer their thoughts or even talk about the case at all if it could potentially be seen by members of the media?
I mean, it's possible. The question would be, are they witnesses? I mean, have they given evidence over to the police of any kind? And, the concept of a witness is a fairly broad concept in and of itself. You're going to have people that are fact witnesses. I saw the man's pickup truck at this intersection at this time. You're going to have witnesses who maybe aren't going to come in till punishment, if there is a punishment phase of the trial. And so they may only be relevant for just showing the emotional impact of her loss. But I mean, the way that the order is worded, I think if there's a reasonable belief that person is going to be a witness, and the way that the order has phrased that is people who have already given information to the police or the district attorney's office up to this point, then yeah, I mean, they're going to be affected by the order and they're not going to be able to discuss it. And I mean, it's going to be difficult for them.
Jordan, for you yesterday, you and I went to the civil side, to the family side, and it was the CPS, Child Protective Services side of yesterday for Brad Simpson. Talk about that and talk about what stood out for you? I know we talked about it later,
Yes.
but talk about what stood out yesterday.
So yesterday was kind of a check-in on the two youngest Simpson children. There are two that are considered adults already, but the two youngest are now staying with relatives. So it was a check-in for them to see how they're doing in that placement. If they need anything, we learned that they're doing okay according to their advocates and they're getting therapy. The interesting part to me, Brad Simpson appeared via Zoom. So you saw him in his red jumpsuit with his headset on so that he could listen to the court proceedings. And something that I think a lot of people might not realize in the civil proceedings is that Suzanne Simpson has a lawyer in there who is asking questions and tasked with finding her, essentially, and asking questions on her behalf. So when Suzanne's lawyer was asking questions of Brad as a witness, his lawyer would jump in and plead the fifth. Her first question was, "Mr. Simpson, do you have any idea where Suzanne is?" And his lawyer immediately jumped in and said, "I object to that, and I would like my client to plead the fifth. There are criminal proceedings going on," which the judge did remind Brad Simpson right off the bat, is anything you say here could be taken in this criminal case too, since it's going on at the same time. But every question is
And there it is. You
is
see
pleading
him
the
as
fifth.
he looked yesterday, what Jordan's talking about right now on that screen with the headphones on.
Mhm.
So how many questions? I think it was about 5 or 6.
It was 5 or 6, and you could tell that Suzanne Simpson's lawyer was getting frustrated that they were pleading the fifth to every single one. And she pleaded with the judge at one point and said, it's my job to try to find my client. I need to be able to ask these questions, because he was objecting to all of the different questions and then pleading the fifth. And the judge acknowledged that and said, that is what you've been tasked with. You do get to ask these questions. But then eventually she said it's clear that this is going to be the strategy, that they're going to plead the fifth as this goes on.
Can you talk about pleading the fifth? I know we had a conversation before, and I don't think a lot of people are aware of what happens when you plead the fifth on the civil side.
Sure. So, I think any lawyer would advise Mr. Simpson to do as he did. He's in the middle of a criminal case. These are questions that drive to the heart of what he's been indicted for. He should not be giving any evidence at this time. That's his right, and so he needs to be invoking the fifth. It obviously is a difficult circumstance because he's appearing by Zoom. His lawyer's in the courtroom. That makes it a bit more challenging because the person has a right to consult with counsel before they ask a potentially or answer a potentially incriminating question about themselves. And in a lot of civil litigation that touches and concerns a criminal matter, the idea is that preferably we would stay the civil case and it wouldn't go forward until after the criminal case is resolved, because one of the effects that we were talking about is invoking your Fifth Amendment protects you from that silence being used negatively against you in the criminal case. They can't ever tell the jury that you were asked this question point blank and you invoked your Fifth Amendment. And the jury will be instructed that even if they're aware of a conversation like this, sort of, 20,000 feet looking at the situation, that they need to respect the fact that the Fifth Amendment is there to protect the rights of the accused. It protects everybody. You're not to give it any weight or consideration whatsoever. But on the civil context, if you're asked a question in a deposition or a written interrogatory or a situation like this where there's a hearing, and you would choose to invoke your fifth, the same protections apply for the criminal stuff, but the courts in the civil case is entitled to deem your invocation of the fifth as an admission to the question, which, obviously can be subject to serious abuses. You get your opponent up on the witness stand in a civil case and you could just ask every awful question in the book, knowing they'll invoke the fifth because they have a pending criminal matter.
Did you kill your wife, for example?
For example, right. And then, that's going to be fairly powerful weaponry in the civil litigation moving forward. But I think it couldn't be helped here because this is a matter that affects the children, and there are things that have to be rolling forward on that. It's a time-sensitive matter. We can't leave the question about the children's well-being up for later debate after his criminal case resolves. So it's a little bit different than if there was a wrongful death suit or some other lawsuit related to the criminal behavior.
What was amazing to us, and we sat in court and we all kind of, our eyeballs almost popped out was when they asked about the ads. I believe they put ads out looking for Suzanne Simpson, and then also stating that if she doesn't respond, she could lose the rights over her children, and Brad could lose the rights over their children. And when you're sitting there and you're looking at it in its totality, you're kind of like, duh, hello, he's charged with murder. But when it comes to legal, that's a process they have to go through, correct?
Right. And, I don't really deal with Child Protective Services very much, except, tangentially to criminal matters. If something like this comes up in a case, I typically will hire in someone with a lot more experience in Child Protective Services cases. So, I can't really speak as to exactly how this issue is being framed or what they're fighting over. But, yes, there's a whole parallel world that goes on in the civil context, and particularly with Child Protective Services, anytime that there's a criminal matter. And it's a tragedy that this has got to be sorted out. Who's going to be providing for these children while this is pending? If he is found guilty and sentenced to prison, what will happen then? How do we address the issue of Suzanne's rights? No body has been found. They can't establish her death. It's a mess.
And operationally, that was an interesting piece of it to watch when they're coming up with the care plan for the children. They talk about Brad and what needs to be done in order for him to
He needs to go to classes, and substance abuse training.
He has to have an assessment, but they also have a care plan for Suzanne. Should Suzanne return, hypothetically, they said that they wanted to conduct an assessment, but they said we haven't been able to contact her, so obviously no assessment has happened. But they plan for everything in that way. And I thought that was interesting, just kind of from an outside perspective looking in, that they're planning for everything.
Yeah, well, and I commend him for that. The theory that the state is proceeding on is that Suzanne's dead, and there's obviously a lot of evidence that tends to indicate that, at least what we've talked about in the media. But is it possible that she's gone off to Ibiza or something, and she just isn't around, and she's abandoned her responsibility to her children? They have to plan for that possibility. This man's presumed innocent. This issue hasn't been adjudicated by anybody, so they have to kind of have contingency plans in place.
I did want to ask, this plan that they've prepared for Brad Simpson entails a bunch of classes and things like this. Brad Simpson has been in administrative segregation since he's been arrested. So that's 23 hours in the cell, 1 hour out. Do you think that it's feasible for him to even complete some sort of care plan as prescribed by Child Protective Services? And if not, how is that fair? But you're essentially creating a plan that somebody cannot comply with.
Exactly. My opinion on this is no more informed than anyone in the general public, because again, I don't handle these, but it does to me seem like it was just a pro forma action to even impose those kinds of things. They don't care, and they're not concerned. Like they don't expect him to be able to do it. He can't do it. But talking about it as thinking of it from a contingency point of view, it's very possible Mr. Simpson will eventually be able to post bail. And if he is able to post bail, then he might want to avail himself of these things in order to maintain his relationship with his children.
I know yesterday when his brother spoke, he spoke about social media, and he didn't sound too happy. Then he kind of changed what he said a little bit, saying that people out there want to help to find Suzanne. For both of you, and for you, John, I'm going to start with the ladies here first. How concerned are you also, if we don't keep covering Suzanne and we don't keep putting it out there, that someone that may have that little piece of the puzzle won't hear about it? It takes the average person about 8 times of hearing something until it registers. So keeping the story, which is a story, but it's also someone's life. There are children involved. How concerned are you guys that people may forget about this case and someone may have that piece of the puzzle?
Personally, I'm not necessarily concerned about that. Oftentimes when you read arrest affidavits, for example, individuals with knowledge that is integral to the case are often searching for through the headlines, sharing the headlines amongst other individuals with information about the case. And so those individuals that do have that information, they know. I think in terms of the pressure or feeling compelled to say something, I honestly think that over time, individuals might be more compelled to come forward if they see that the case has not been able to move forward with what investigators have at that point. And I think in certain cases, individuals with information might feel that, okay, that nugget of info that I had might be what takes this case across the finish line. So yes, I do need to come forward. But that's just my first impression.
What do you think?
I think that it's our responsibility to cover this no matter what. I think the gag order is going to make it more difficult,
Yes.
but that doesn't mean that we're going to stop, because I think overwhelmingly nobody wants to see a case become a cold case. Everyone is someone's loved one. Everyone is someone's loved one. So I feel that it's our responsibility to keep that going in a respectful way, in an accurate way, as best we can.
What do you think? I mean, you deal on the criminal side, but I'm sure there's been times that you're looking for someone that may have a piece of information. Not everyone, we're in this world. So to us, we know everything about it, but not everybody follows it
Sure.
as closely.
Well, I mean, the idea that there is a public eye being brought to anything like this is important. I mean, the public has a right to know what's going on in a criminal proceeding. The public has a right to know what the police and their DA are doing with respect to these issues. And the press is the only thing that can keep those people truly accountable on a global scale. The tragedy is there will eventually be a point where covering a story loses its effect. People sort of numb themselves to it. The other tragedy is that there are lots of unsolved homicides in San Antonio that are cold cases. And there's a lot of violence in the city that doesn't necessarily get as much attention, or it can only get sort of a very superficial gloss because there's some, there's blood in the streets. There's someone wandering around with a knife. And I mean, those things are catchy and they get some attention, but a lot of times the why of those stories and what's actually going on in the city that don't get reported on. And there's only so many hours in the day, and the public only has so much patience for that. But I mean, I think that there will be a natural cycle to this. I mean, it'll die down as the lawyers really get into the work and as the behind the scenes stuff starts to really pick up steam. And then one day it'll be to trial and it'll be back in the public eye again.
So I think for me personally, I'm going to answer my own question. And I keep bringing up Patty Vaughn's case. 28 years later, this Christmas, 28 years ago, this mother went missing. Blood was found all over the inside of her house with luminol. When they sprayed the luminol, you could see drag marks. You could see swipes. You could see blood that had been in a bucket. And no one was charged, even though you go to the DPS website and it says that the main suspect is her spouse. 28 years later, I get a call yesterday from someone who's had information that they've wanted to share. 28 years later. So I don't think it's ever like too late to come forward. That's my thought with this. And of course, for me, and I think for all of us when we do this, is the fact that there's still children out there who don't know where their mother is. There's a mother who's in her 80s who doesn't know where her child is. And someone out there may have seen something that later they're like, you know what? That was kind of odd. And that may be that little puzzle, the piece to the puzzle. And of course, Brad is still innocent. He has to be presumed innocent until he's found guilty. So what if there is somebody else involved? Or what if it was another case? I know there's a lot of rumors going on in Almost Park and Alamo Heights. And I think we've heard them all. So what if there is another person involved or something else?
Absolutely. I mean, there are lots of moving parts to this. And because this is a situation where there is still a lot of mystery, but the process is going forward as though it's an open and shut matter. There are going to be lingering doubts about what exactly happened. Is he responsible for her death? Maybe. Is he responsible for something else and her death is incidental to that? Maybe. Is somebody else responsible for her death and he's helping that person for some reason? Maybe. And those possibilities merit our attention and our consideration, both because he's presumed innocent and because we want to get to the truth of it. We would like to find her. I think that's something that's on everyone's mind. Thinking about cold cases, thinking about some of the more historically interesting mysteries out there. I mean, one thing that seems to be a common theme in those cases is that the amount of public attention that gets brought to it has the unintended and unfortunate effect sometimes of clouding and muddying the water to where you'll have 5 or 6. I mean, think about, there are people who make a living calling themselves ripperologists that just study the case of Jack the Ripper. They all have a theory. None of those theories, they have almost nothing in common except an agreed list of people that are this person's victims. It just encourages a lot of speculation and sometimes it ends up helping, but sometimes it maybe makes it harder to figure out what went on. Because there will be people that are following the news coverage on this who, bless their hearts, they may have a mental health problem. They may decide that they've figured it out and it's actually a conspiracy involving the Illuminati and all those things. And there may be someone who's just mistaken about something and they give information and the police really chase that lead and then it turns out, no, that isn't. Yeah, you had the wrong car. Those things happen all the time. So it's a balance. How do you address it? I don't know.
Ladies, final thoughts?
Thank you for joining us.
Oh,
Yes,
my pleasure.
thank you for your time. He's expensive.
Anything else that you'd want to share before we close this podcast?
Ultimately, I think it's important to remember that we, as members of the media, journalists, we're also human. We have families. And when we cover these cases, we take that into account. We try to be as sensitive as possible when covering these cases, and it's not just a headline for us. And so I think that's important to stress.
And if you're looking to see more of the facts of this case, any of the affidavits, the indictment documents, a map of all the locations that we know of so far that Brad Simpson was, a timeline of where he was, we have all that on our websites as well.
And I think for me personally, and for you guys also, it's the fact that there are 4 children. There's a family that doesn't know where their loved one is. The facts right now, as we know them, which aren't a lot, point a certain way that Suzanne may have in fact been killed, but that doesn't make it any easier for her family. Also, the last thing I want to remind people, you talked about the women that were sitting in the courtroom wearing pink and purple or lilac yesterday for support. I would ask people to take another step. Don't just wear the pink and purple. Stand up, offer help. We all know somebody that's going through a relationship that may be deemed family violence. Try to help out before you end up in this place. For myself, Jami Virgin, Mariah, and Jordan, and also John, thank you so much for being here. We will have a lot more on this case. You can go to our YouTube Live, and you can also go to our websites to get more. And I want to thank you for being here with us today.